Chapter 1: The Meeting of Cultures. This chapter starts off talking about the civilizations in South and North America. In South America, there are the Incas in Peru, the Aztecs in Mexico, and later on the Mayans in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. They were powerful empires and conquered the areas around them. They had agricultural systems and lots of cities such as Tenochtitlan in the Aztec region. They also had architectural structures unlike anything in North America. In North America, they did not form empires like in South America. There were a variety of civilizations. Many different types of Indian tribes and such. As my teacher says, where you live determines how you live. So, the Indians living in different regions lived off different ways of life. Like in the Northwest, they lived on the coast, so they had salmon fishing. In the western areas, they had fishing, hunting, and gathering. In the eastern woodlands, they lived in the forests of the eastern U.S. and sometimes had permanent settlements and agriculture and things like that. In the southwest, the Pueblos, who lived in adobe buildings, they were Indians in the southwest desert areas. In the northeast, they tended to exploit the land, farming it until the nutrients were like nada anymore. And so they would move on. Every time they got done with the land, they would just move on. Also, Indians in general, they like to be considered by the name of their tribe, like Cherokee or Creek or Iroquois or Pueblo. Well, Pueblo, there's 7 different kinds of Pueblos. So even then you have to use their specific name or they don't like it. They refer to themselves as their tribes rather than a large Indian nation. So then there was an agricultural/cultural revolution. Even though some had already settled in permanent settlements, more of them started to do that and developing agricultural systems, and they focused more on developing their culture like religion and architecture and such things as that. Now, Indians are happy living in the New World, as it would later be considered by the Europeans. But now, the Europeans are starting to get an interest in exploration. During the Dark Ages, there was the Black Plague, and things weren't so good in Europe. So, after the plague had settled down, the population in Europe rebounded, and that was one of the reasons why they started getting interested in exploration. There was also a reawakening of commerce. They wanted to find new markets to sell their items and new trade routes to other areas. Rather than the feudal state of Europe, they started forming centralized nation states, also known as more powerful and unified government. They wanted to find, because of their unification, they were able to fund and get together expeditions to new worlds. They wanted to, first of all, they wanted to find an alternate route to Asia to avoid the Middle East and Middleland. The first to start off the exploration, whatever it is, the first to start off were the Portuguese. starting with Prince Henry the Navigator. But he wanted to explore the western coast of Africa. Then, later on, as we all know, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But he didn't find the western route to Asia like he wanted to. He discovered the New World, but never knew that he had. He always believed that he landed in the East Indies. Ferdinand Magellan led the first circumnavigation of the world, but he himself didn't make it. He got in a fight in the Philippines and died there. Amerigo Vespucci recognized the New World as new continents, and he had the privilege of having the Americas named after him. Then along came the Spanish. They were mainly conquistadors who were looking for money in the New World, anything to make them money. They were all about greed, and because of their greed, they were brutal to the Indians. Hernando Cortez conquered the Aztecs in Mexico, but the primary ally was not people. It was disease. The European disease of smallpox affected the Indians horribly and almost wiped out their population. Francisco Pizarro conquers Peru, again with disease. The Indians were just not accustomed to European disease, and it affected them terribly. Because of their desire for wealth, they would subjugate the Indians, and they would do anything to become rich and powerful, which they did. However, later on, the Ordinances of Discovery banned brutal military conquests. Instead, colonization was the main form of going to the New World. One of the primary reasons the Spanish went to the New World after their conquistador mission, they formed Catholic missions to convert natives because they thought they were savage and needed to become civilized in their terms. They also formed presidios or military bases, such as St. Augustine in Florida. Then there were other areas of the New World that the Spanish conquered. They had a lot of South America and a lot of Central America. And a man named Don Juan de Oñate formed a colony in New Mexico. There he formed encomiendas, which were harsh systems of extracting labor from the natives because the Spanish didn't want to work. So they had other people do it for them. However, then, there was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which was a reaction to Spanish trying to suppress their native traditions. They had temporary success with this revolt, but the Spanish returned and suppressed it. Then Spain tried to fix the conflict that they had with the natives. The first thing they tried to do was to assimilate Indians into their own culture from a very young age, teaching them Catholicism when they were very young, etc., etc. The second thing they tried to do was to allow Indians more freedom. They gave them more land, they had a less oppressive system of labor, etc. So by this point, Spain has a vast empire in the Americas. The monarchy had direct authority to the colonies. They established rigid control, especially on the mercantile. It was only their ships that could go into the ports. No other ships could. They were more successful than the British in extracting wealth from the Americas, like gold and silver, because that was basically all they wanted. Money. The Spanish were just greedy. In fact, Europeans in general are greedy. Anyway, unlike the English, who would later form colonies in the Americas, the Spanish ruled rather than peopled their empire. They just told everybody what to do. They just had a few people in their settlements, whereas the English actually sent people to the colonies. Again, all throughout the empire, the European disease just devastated the Indian population. In some places, 90% of the natives died from European disease. That is a staggering percentage. 9 out of 10 people died from disease. It's hard to imagine if that would happen today. Yeah, that would be awful. Anyway. Not only was the disease just a natural part of... I mean, they couldn't help that they brought the diseases with them, but it was also part of their policy of subjugation and extermination of the Indians. I mean, it's one thing to rule over a large population of Indians, but if all the Indians are dead, then it's easier to rule, isn't it? It was their attitude, anyway. But the Spanish interactions with the Indians were not all bad like that. They had many exchanges of crops and livestock. The Spanish brought the horse back to the Americas, which was important, and the maize, and the Indians had a crop called maize, which is corn, which greatly helped the Europeans, both in the colonies and in Europe. There was also a strict racial hierarchy. The Peninsulares, which is the Spanish-born, are at the top, and mestizos and mulattoes and other mixed later on at the bottom. The mestizos are the mixed native and Spanish. There was frequent intermarriage between the Spanish and the natives for one reason. Like I said, the Spanish did not people their colonies, so they married... The Spanish men married the native women, and such as that. Then we're on to discussing. Well, anyway, as I said before, the natives were used for labor since the Spanish did not want to work. But the disease just decreased the population, as well as war decreased the native population, and so the Spanish needed a new labor source. So where did they go? Africa. A little background about Africa first. Well, there's not much here in this chapter anyway. The Ghana and Mali were empires in Africa, and they had contact with the Mediterranean, and they were not imperial. Empires in Africa, and they had contact with the Europeans. On the other hand, Benin, Congo, and Songhai were isolated. They were kind of in the center of Africa, and they weren't as unified in an empire. They were more like in villages and such. They were politically fragmented, as the book says. The African societies were matrilineal, similar to the natives, where their society is based on the mother rather than the father, as in a European family. Slave trade had already been going on within Africa. In Africa, it was not like we know slavery today. It wasn't permanent. Their children didn't inherit the bondage, and such as that. It was not as harsh as in the Caribbean and South America and North America. But then there was trade in Africa, slave trade in Africa, and then the Portuguese take slaves from Africa over to Brazil and the Caribbean to work on their sugar plantations, because sugar was becoming a very important crop to Europeans, and like I said, they didn't want to work, so they needed a whole lot of labor to keep up with the demand for sugar. So then we finally get to the English. There was a man named John Cabot who searched for a northwest passage to Asia. He was, well, not he in particular, but the English were interested in, they thought that the New World would be a new place to start, a new time. It would be a perfect land, a utopia. But that was not how things turned out. Anyway, in Europe, the wool trade was exploding, so farms had to be transformed into sheep pens, and so that gave farmers out of job, and it restricted the food supply. What are you gonna do about that? Settle new colonies, I guess. So the English had various reasons for settling. First of all, they had economic reasons. Merchants were prospering from foreign trade. They joined forces and formed charter companies, which gave them, the charter companies had a monopoly for trading in a certain region. And they had the system called mercantilism, which said that the nation is most important in the economy rather than individuals. The goal is to export your nation's goods in exchange for gold and silver to increase the wealth of your nation. And it also increased the attractiveness of colonies, because if you have colonies, then that gives you more goods to exchange for gold and silver, thus making you more rich. And of course, the colonies, they would later find out that there were plenty of resources there, so it kind of did help them in their mercantilism goals. A man named Richard Hakluyt, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, said that colonies create new markets for English goods and help alleviate poverty and unemployment in Europe, because people could come from Europe and go to the New World and live in this happy new utopia, and everything would be grand. But sadly, that's not how things turned out. In addition to economic reasons, they also had religious reasons for settlement. In Europe, Martin Luther challenges the Catholic Church, which starts off the Protestant Reformation. A man named John Calvin promotes the doctrine of predestination, which is unlike anything that Catholic Church teaches. The English Reformation was between King Henry VIII and the Pope, because King Henry wanted to get a divorce and the Pope wouldn't let him. So he breaks ties with the Catholic Church. But he doesn't really care about starting a new religion or whatever. He's just like, okay, I got my divorce, I'm okay now. and his daughter Mary takes the throne and reinstitutes Catholicism. She persecutes anyone who isn't a Catholic. She's very strict about that. Then later on, Elizabeth takes the throne and breaks away from the Catholic Church again and forms the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church. Then some of the Protestants, called Puritans, wanted to purify the Anglican Church. And then there were radical Puritans who were separatists, and they wanted to separate completely from the church and worship as they pleased. Anyway, the Puritans demanded reform in the church, but nobody would let them reform. And King James I antagonizes the Puritans about this, and this just furthers their desire. Oh, we need to go someplace else so we can worship the way we want to. In Ireland, England subjugated Ireland because they were considered savage, the way their culture and such was. Sir Humphrey Gilbert introduced the idea that English plantations should be completely separate from the natives, and this arose from their subjugation of Ireland and such as that. Then the French and Dutch. The French found their first settlement in Quebec. I don't know if that's how you say it, but Quebec. They forged partnerships with the natives. They were known for being good friends with the natives, except for the Iroquois Confederacy. They did not have a good friendship there. The French also had Jesuit missionaries, which were basically Catholic missionaries in their settlements. Now, I have no idea how to pronounce these words, but I'm going to try. Coureurs de bois were fur traders and trappers who developed an extensive trade, I'm guessing with the Indians. I don't know if that was very clear in the book. I might have been reading it wrong. Oh well. Then there were seigneuries, I think, which were agricultural estates developed along the St. Lawrence River. Again, they had the conflict with the Iroquois Indians. And then we're back to the Dutch. We're to the Dutch a little bit, not much. We talk about how Henry Hudson explored the rivers in New York, and he thought he found the river to the Pacific Ocean because the river was so wide, but that was not the case. His exploration led to the Dutch claim on the territory and a permanent Dutch presence called New Amsterdam. And then we're back to the English again to sort of finish up the chapter. The English wanted to settle the New World, but they were still afraid of the Spanish. So, when the Spanish Armada, which was a large fleet of ships, like large militia of ships, they attempted to invade England, but the English defeated them, so now they were no longer scared about the Spanish. So, started colonizing. The pioneer of English colonization was Sir Humphrey Gilbert, as said before. He led an expedition to Newfoundland, but his ship sank and he failed. And then he had a partner or family member. He establishes the colony of Roanoke. He goes there, comes back a couple of times, but then one time he comes back and there's nothing there. Everything's gone. It's deserted, except for the word Croatoan written on a post, and nobody knows why Roanoke disappeared or why there's a word Croatoan on a post. Roanoke is considered the lost colony because of this. And then After this, there were new colonial charters formed. The one called London for the South area of North America, and Plymouth for the North area. And that pretty much completes the chapter. Hope you enjoyed that. That was my first video. Was that good? It wasn't all that entertaining. But if you learned something, that's good. See you later.